And guess what made them stand firm on the decision? What made them stand firm on the decision? Hey, hun. What made them stand firm on the decision was the fact that they just brought the kids to school. They just brought the kids to school. And it was in a school zone. It's like everything that happened bad is the reason she cannot get out. Everything that happened bad. School zone. Unarmed. Violation of using the CCL. Okay? It wasn't self-defense. That was a complete lie. Listen, we know this, but
Welcome to Crime Scene Chronicles, where we just don't follow the crime. We explore the mind behind it. Subscribe and stay with us, because some truths are hidden deeper than you think.
The Romeca Meeks case has taken another dramatic turn, and this time, the focus is on Holly Johnson and a reported appellate court decision that could have major consequences for what happens next. According to reports circulating about the case, Holly Johnson's appeal has been denied, raising a major question. What does this decision actually mean for her legal future? While online reports have described the ruling as a loss for Johnson, viewers should remember that court decisions and their legal effects depend on the actual filings and orders entered in the case. The case centers on the fatal shooting of Romeca Meeks Blackman in Chicago. Johnson has faced allegations connected to the shooting, while the circumstances surrounding the confrontation, the evidence presented by prosecutors, and the competing accounts have continued to generate intense public attention. Now, the title of this story raises a major question. What happens if an appeal fails? An appeal is not simply another trial. Instead, an appellate court generally examines whether legal errors occurred in the proceedings below. That means a ruling against Johnson could potentially leave an earlier decision intact, depending on exactly what issue was appealed. But there is an important distinction viewers should understand. Losing an appeal does not automatically mean a person has been found guilty of murder. The precise consequences depend on what decision was being challenged and what the appellate court actually ruled. So, what was Holly Johnson challenging? What did the court consider? And could this decision affect the next major stage of the Romeca Meeks case? Those are the questions we will break down throughout this series. If you want straightforward updates as this case develops, like and subscribe to Crime Scene Chronicles, and stay with us as we examine what this reported appellate decision could mean for Holly Johnson and the pursuit of justice for Romeca Meeks. The reported appellate decision has brought renewed attention to one of the most important questions in the Romeca Meeks case. What exactly was Holly Johnson asking the higher court to change? An appeal is different from starting the entire case over. The appellate court generally reviews the legal issues raised by the defense and examines whether the lower court made an error serious enough to justify changing its ruling. In Johnson's case, public reports have described an appeal connected to her release and the conditions surrounding her detention. Reports also indicate that her legal team has continued to challenge decisions affecting her ability to remain out of custody while the case moves forward. That distinction is extremely important. A ruling against a defendant on an appeal does not automatically determine the ultimate verdict in the underlying murder case. Instead, the significance depends on the exact issue the appellate court was asked to review. The Romeca Meeks case has already attracted intense attention because of the circumstances surrounding Meeks' death and the allegations against Johnson. Public reporting has identified Johnson as facing a first-degree murder charge in connection with the fatal shooting. But as the case continues, the legal battle is not simply about what happened on the day of the shooting. It is also about evidence, witness accounts, court procedures, pretrial decisions, and the arguments made by both sides. That is where the appellate ruling becomes significant. If the higher court leaves the lower court's decision intact, Johnson's attorneys may have fewer options on that particular issue. But that does not necessarily end every possible legal challenge available to the defense. The bigger question now becomes, what happens next? And that question takes us directly to the evidence and arguments that could become even more important as the Romeca Meeks case continues. With the reported appeal decision drawing attention, the spotlight now turns back to the evidence surrounding Romeca Meeks' death. At the center of the case are competing accounts of what happened before and during the shooting. Public reports have referenced witnesses, prior interactions between the people involved, and disagreements about who initiated the confrontation. One report from Fox 32 Chicago's coverage describes testimony concerning the interaction between Johnson and Meeks before the shooting. Those details could become extremely important, because prosecutors and defense attorneys can interpret the same events very differently. For prosecutors, evidence may be used to establish the elements of the charges against Johnson, and challenge any claim that the shooting was legally justified. For the defense, the goal could be to create reasonable doubt, or demonstrate that the circumstances surrounding the confrontation were different from the prosecution's interpretation. And that is why every piece of evidence matters. Witness statements, forensic evidence, video footage, phone records, and other investigative material can potentially influence how a jury understands the events. But until evidence is formally presented and tested in court, public discussion should not be treated as proof of guilt. There is also another important issue. The appellate decision itself does not replace the trial process. Even if Johnson has lost an appeal involving a particular ruling, the underlying criminal case can continue according to the court schedule and future proceedings. That means the next major development could come from a hearing, a new filing, additional evidence, or another decision from the court. For Romeca Meeks' family and everyone following the case, the unanswered questions remain enormous. What evidence will ultimately carry the most weight? Will the prosecution's version of events survive courtroom scrutiny? And what strategy will Johnson's defense use as the case moves forward? Those questions, the reported appellate ruling could make the next stage of Holly Johnson's legal battle even more important. When an appellate court rejects an argument raised by the defense, the lower court decision generally remains in place, unless another legal avenue changes it. Reports circulating about the Romeca Meeks case describe Johnson's appeal as having been denied by an Illinois appellate court. But the ruling should not be confused with a final determination of guilt. The underlying criminal case still requires the prosecution to prove its allegations in court. The defense, meanwhile, has the opportunity to challenge the prosecution's evidence and present its own interpretation of what happened. That is where the case could become even more complicated. One of the major issues surrounding the investigation has been the evidence connected to Romeca Meeks and the circumstances leading to her death. Reports have indicated that prosecutors sought medical records from Stroger Hospital as part of the case. Medical evidence can potentially become significant in a homicide prosecution because it may help establish the nature of injuries, the cause of death, and other factual details. However, the existence of medical records alone does not establish who is responsible for a crime. The defense will likely scrutinize how every piece of evidence was collected, preserved, and interpreted. Was the investigation conducted properly? Are the witnesses reliable? Does the physical evidence support the prosecution's theory? And perhaps most importantly, can the prosecution prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt? Those questions cannot be answered simply by headlines or social media discussions. As the legal proceedings continue, the appellate ruling may be only one chapter in a much larger story. The next courtroom developments could determine whether the case moves closer to trial, changes direction, or produces another unexpected legal challenge. The reported appellate decision leaves Holly Johnson and her defense team facing an important moment in the Romeca Meeks case. The appeal may have focused on a specific legal issue rather than the ultimate question of whether Johnson is guilty. That distinction is critical because an appellate ruling does not replace the criminal trial itself. Now attention turns toward what happens in the lower court. Future hearings could address evidence, motions filed by the defense, prosecution requests, scheduling issues, and other matters that could shape the eventual trial. The medical evidence could also become an important part of the prosecution's case if it is formally introduced and shown to be relevant. Reports have indicated that prosecutors sought Meeks' medical records, adding another layer to the evidence being gathered. But viewers should be careful with claims that any particular piece of evidence has already proved what happened. Until evidence is presented and challenged in court, allegations and interpretations remain just that. The same applies to claims about Johnson's legal status. Public reports have discussed pre-trial release and appellate proceedings, but the precise effect of any ruling depends on the official court record and the specific order involved. What remains clear is that the Romeca Meeks case is far from a simple story. There are questions about the events leading up to the shooting, the evidence collected afterward, the competing legal arguments, and the decisions being made by the courts. And with every new filing or hearing, another piece of the picture could emerge. Like and subscribe to Scene Chronicles for more updates as we continue following the Romeca Meeks case and examining the legal developments surrounding Holly Johnson. The reported appellate decision may have changed the legal landscape for Holly Johnson, but it does not answer every question surrounding the Romeca Meeks case. The biggest questions still involve what happened before the shooting, what happened during the confrontation, and what the evidence ultimately proves. For prosecutors, the challenge is to present a clear timeline and connect the available evidence to the charges against Johnson. For the defense, the goal is to challenge that timeline and show why the prosecution's interpretation may not tell the complete story. That could make witness testimony extremely important. A witness may remember an event differently from another person. Surveillance footage may show only part of an encounter. Physical evidence may answer one question while creating another. And when all of those pieces are placed together, attorneys on both sides will have the opportunity to argue what they believe the evidence means. The appellate ruling also does not mean that every argument made by the prosecution has been accepted as fact. An appellate court generally focuses on the specific legal issues presented to it. The underlying criminal allegations still have to be handled through the appropriate trial process. That distinction is important because headlines can sometimes make an appellate decision sound like the final chapter. Depending on the exact ruling, the defense could potentially explore other legal options while prosecutors could continue preparing their case. For the Meeks family, however, the legal process represents something much more personal. Romeca lost her life, and the case continues to raise questions about the events that led to her death. For Holly Johnson, the consequences of the case could be equally significant. The court will ultimately have to weigh the evidence according to the law rather than public opinion. And that means the next hearing could be another important step in determining where this case goes from here. After an appellate decision, attention naturally turns toward the next move. For Holly Johnson's defense team, that could mean carefully reviewing the court's reasoning and determining whether additional legal options remain available. For prosecutors, it means continuing to prepare the case and respond to whatever challenges the defense brings forward. But there is another important question. What evidence will ultimately make it into the courtroom? Not everything investigators collect automatically becomes evidence that a jury can consider. Attorneys can challenge evidence on different legal grounds, and judges can be asked to determine whether particular material can be admitted. That means the next phase could involve arguments that the public never sees in viral headlines. Motions could be filed, evidence could be challenged, witnesses could be questioned, and prosecutors and defense attorneys could continue fighting over how the jury should eventually understand the events surrounding Romeca Meeks' death. The reported appellate ruling, therefore, represents an important development, but it should not be mistaken for the conclusion of the entire case. The ultimate question remains whether the prosecution can prove the charges beyond a reasonable doubt. At the same time, Johnson's defense will have the opportunity to present its arguments and challenge the evidence against her. For viewers following the case, this is where patience becomes important. A new headline can create the impression that everything has suddenly been decided. But criminal cases often develop through a series of smaller courtroom decisions, each one potentially affecting what happens next. The Romeca Meeks case is no different. The appellate ruling may have closed one legal door, but the broader case continues to move forward. And as the next proceedings approach, the evidence, the legal arguments, and the decisions made by both sides could determine what comes next for Holly Johnson. The biggest question is no longer simply what happened during the previous appeal. It is what will the defense and prosecution do next, and how will the court respond? The reported appellate decision may have closed one chapter in Holly Johnson's legal battle, but it does not necessarily close the Romeca Meeks case itself. The next stage could be just as important. Johnson's defense will have to consider the appellate court's reasoning and determine what legal options remain available. Prosecutors, meanwhile, will continue building their case around the evidence they believe connects Johnson to Romeca's death. And ultimately, the courtroom, not social media, will be where those competing arguments are tested. The evidence could include witness testimony, forensic findings, surveillance footage, medical records, and other investigative material. Each piece will have to be examined carefully, because one dramatic headline does not automatically establish what happened. There is also the question of self-defense. Johnson's defense has maintained that the circumstances surrounding the confrontation are important to understanding why the shooting occurred. Prosecutors have presented a different interpretation of the events. That disagreement could become one of the central issues as the case moves forward. The appellate decision may therefore be significant, but it should not be described as proof that Johnson has been found guilty. An appeal involving a particular ruling and the ultimate criminal trial are two separate legal stages. For Romeca Meeks' loved ones, however, the case remains deeply personal. They are still waiting for answers about the events that ended Romeca's life. For Holly Johnson, the case represents a serious legal battle with potentially life-changing consequences. And for everyone watching, the most important thing is to separate what has actually been established in court from what is being claimed online. As new hearings, filings, and evidence emerge, the picture may become clearer. The reported appellate ruling may have changed the direction of Holly Johnson's legal strategy, but the final outcome of the Romeca Meeks case will ultimately depend on the evidence and the decisions made through the justice system. So the question now is simple. What happens next? And that is the part of this story we will continue to follow. And if you enjoyed this investigation, please like this video, subscribe to Scene Chronicles, and turn on notifications so you never miss another deep dive into the world's most compelling true crime cases. Thank you for watching. Stay safe, stay informed, and remember, sometimes the biggest mystery isn't what people are saying online. It's what the evidence will ultimately reveal.